Today signifies the culmination of many years of hard work in the relentless pursuit of knowledge.
Knowledge that will enable a person to embrace opportunities and take on challenges with clear vision and purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Moving Up ceremony of Daniel Maramba National High School for the school year 2021 to 2022. Friends, the Philippine National Anthem, Opening Prayer, Regional Hymn, Pangasinan Hymn, and SDO1 Hymn.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Kayang magiliw, telas ng sinakanan, alam ng puso, sa titik mo'y buhay. Lupang binirang, tuyag ka ng magiting, sa mandulupin, di ka pasisigil, sa nagatak tutok sa simoy at sa langit mo pangaw, ay hinatang tudla, kawin sa pagkayang minamahal, ang isang ng matawad mo'y tagumpay na naghihingi, ang bituin at araw niya kailan ang may maghihingi. Luman ang araw ng walhagin pagsingka, mo'y langit sa piling mo. Ang higaya ng pagkay mga amin, at mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord, mighty God, Lord of all. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord, mighty God, Lord of all. Even the lowly sparrow finds a home for her brood, and the swallow a nest for herself where she may lay her young. In your altars, my King and my God. Lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord, mighty God, Lord of all. Blessed are they whose dwelling is your own, Lord of peace. Blessed are they, refreshed by springs and by rain, when dryness dawns and skates. Behold my shield, my King, and my God. Lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord, mighty God, Lord of all. I would forsake 1,000 other days anywhere if I can spend one day in your courts, belong to you alone. My strength are you alone, my glory, my King and my God.
place I love so well. It's the home of men who love her, men who died to keep us free, men who told no matter weather that what will never be. Region 1, oh Region 1, there's no better place I see. Region 1, oh Region 1, he rests on my heart to me. From her care I learn my lessons, in her veils I work and pray. She has kept me safe and happy as I live on day by day. From to other lands I wander as I search for wealth and fame. In my heart I will remember. Region 1, beloved land. Region 1, oh Region 1, there's no better place I see. Region 1, oh Region 1, he rests on my heart to be. Other lands I wander as I search for wealth and fame. In my heart I will remember Region 1, beloved name. Region 1. Tandayoni, Pangasinan niya binabli. Doon mo tani aligwas, iuragod ko lawas. Dan puso Pangasinan, agkanalingwanan. Luyak ko yan iyanagan, Bedegdakan yaman. Angkuan nalikwas muna kaya nenggelam, kasih panuring mapulang. Say pangkakal sa tinatay nalilik na, napunta na mabrisika. Say dayak muntak na'y natuktan sa yaman, sedeng nakawalan ngayon. Something mo Pangasinan, Pag-iyan lawas Bangayan. Lawas takan ikan duro Pangasinan, Arun kakal kayo buwan. Panangap mo kung wala na bangunan, ikikinon ko siyo paman. Pangasinan
Words of welcome by our school principal, Dr. Olivia P. Terrado.
My sincerest congratulations to the teaching and non-teaching staff of Maramba National High School, the school stakeholders, the proud parents and guardians of the completers, most especially our dear completers. This year's theme, K-12 graduates, pursuing dreams and fostering resilience in the face of adversity, highlights the achievements of the learners amidst pandemic. This day marks how they thrive the challenges for the entire junior high school and others that seem impossible to overcome. The key to thriving is not the absence of challenges, but the ability to respond to these challenges, and that is resilience. Resilience is the power to grow challenging situations and bouncing back. It empowers you to grow and improve your life. The Hugging Tree tells the story of a little tree precariously growing lonesome on a cliff by a vast and mighty sea. The tree holds fast under the thundering storms and different weather, sustained by the natural world in the kindness and compassion of one little boy. Eventually, the little tree grows until it can hold and shelter others. The resilience of the Hugging Tree calls to mind the potential in all of us to thrive despite times with the challenges brought about by the pandemic, to nurture the little spark of hope, to dream and to grow just where we are. The learner's strength and transformation like the tree is celebrated today with pride. You have proven that indeed K-12 completers can still pursue their dreams and foster resilience even in the face of adversity. Mabuhay, completers!
Presentation of completers by our school principal, Dr. Olivia P. Terrado. Confirmation and acceptance, an inspirational message by our public schools district supervisor, Dr. Diana C. Baguio.
In my capacity as the principal of Daniel Maramba National High School, I have the honor to present to you 905 completers, of whom are 463 males and 442 females for school year 2021-2022. They have satisfactorily completed the requirements prescribed by the Department of Education Junior High School Curriculum. I therefore recommend that they will be confirmed completers.
By the authority vested on me by the officer in charge, Office of the Schools Division Superintendent, and acting upon the recommendation of your principal, that you have successfully completed the requirements prescribed by the Department of Education Junior High School Curriculum, I, Diana C. Baguio, Public Schools District Supervisor, hereby confirm your completion rights and declare you junior high school completers of Daniel Maramba National High School today. I, therefore, confer your rights and privileges appertaining thereto. Congratulations. Greetings to one and all, especially to the completers and graduates of school year 2021-2022. Graduation is one of the most awaited events in the life of a student because it's the day when finally he or she will receive his or her certificate or diploma, a tangible proof that he was able to overcome all the challenges, the testings and obstacles that came his or her way while treading his journey as a student. The last 2 years was indeed very challenging, caused by the unseen enemy that brought so much pain, hardship, difficulty, and even death to some of the students, parents, and teachers. But never did it stop the delivery of instruction to our learners. Our teachers have shown how passionate they were in their duties and responsibilities, may it be at home or in school, just to give the kind of education you deserve. Of course, with the assistance of your parents. For this, they deserve your applause. To all of you, my dear graduates, congratulations. You have finished the race with so much pain and perseverance. I know how hard it was for you to finish your modules and perform the tasks given to you without the assistance of your teachers. Thank you to your parents, ate, kuya, lolo and lola, for being there with you for the last 2 years. A round of applause for them too. To all our very supportive stakeholders, our local government officials, led by our beloved Municipal Mayor, Honorable Joel F. De Los Santos, and the whole Sangguniang Bayan members of Santa Barbara 1, our barangay and SK officials, PTA officers and members, balbalag ya salamat at sikayon amin. To the DepEd officials, from central office down to the district level, my dear school heads, teachers, and non-teaching personnel of Santa Barbara 1 District, thank you very much for all the assistance and support you have extended to all our learners. Your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Above all, allow me to give all the honor, praises, and thanksgiving to our mighty God, who made all things possible for us and for sparing us from the wrath of the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, congratulations, Batch 2022 completers and graduates. God bless everyone. To God be all the glory.
The congratulatory messages of DMNHS PTA President Mr. Nelson Alexander A. Tamayo, Barangay Captain of Poblacion Norte, Honorable Benedicto G. Fajardo, and our Municipal Mayor of Santa Barbara, Honorable Joel F. De Los Santos.
the message of our officer in charge, Schools Division Superintendent, Dr. Ellie S. Obaldo.
Isang pagpupugay at maalab na pagbati sa ating mga principals, head teachers, teachers in charge, mga guro, non-teaching personnel, mga magulang, graduates, completers, at awardees. Mga mahal kong graduates, completers at awardees, ang inyong nakamit na tagumpay ay may tuturing na milestone. Isang tagumpay na nalampasan ang ibayong pagsubok. Sa gitna ng mga pagsubok na dala ng COVID-19, nalampasan ninyo ang mga ito sa pamamagitan ng determinasyon at commitment. Ako'y humahanga at nagagalak sa ipinakita ninyong katapangan na nagpapakita ng inyong exemplary academic performance. Maging alaala sana ang graduation at moving up ceremonies na ito na kaya ninyong lampasan ang anumang pagsubok, makamit lamang ang inyong mga pangarap. Ang inyong mga pangarap ay may hahalin tulad sa isang bituin. Hindi mo man kayang hawakan, ngunit kung patuloy mong susundan ang kanyang liwanag, ay dadalhin ka niya sa iyong destinasyon, ang destinasyon na pagkamit ng iyong pangarap. Maging mas masigasig pa sana kayo, mas maging matiisin, at higit sa lahat, pagtibayin ang paniniwala sa Diyos. Gawin lagi ang tama at dapat. Galingan. Become the best that you can be. Huwag kalimutang magpasalamat sa inyong mga magulang at mga guro. Sa ating mga mahal na magulang, salamat sa inyong mga sakripisyo. Ginampanan ninyo ang napakahalagang papel bilang aming mga partners sa pag-aaral ng inyong mga anak, lalo na sa implementasyon ng distance learning. Patuloy na aasa ang DepEd sa inyong suporta at tulong. Sa mga school heads at mga guro, huwag tayong magsawang gampanan ang ating sinumpaang tungkulin. Ayon nga sa ating mahal na kalihim, whatever is happening in the country, whatever challenges we are facing, education must continue. Education cannot wait. Our learners cannot wait. Ang aming ding pasasalamat sa PTA, provincial government, sa mga local government units, at sa lahat ng mga stakeholders na hindi kami iniwan at ibinigay ang buong suporta para may pagpatuloy ang pag-aaral ng ating mga anak sa gitna ng pandemya. Congratulations! Magandang buhay sa ating lahat!
Ladies and gentlemen, the completers of Daniel Maramba National High School for the school year 2021 to 2022. 10 Newton, Mr. Raymond E. Balansay, Advisor. 10. St. Andrew, Dr. Princess Christine N. Cabansag, Advisor. St. Anthony, Mr. Rodelio M. Dalope, Advisor.
St. Bernadette, Mrs. Virginia E. Orayensa, Advisor. St. Cecilia, Mrs. Rosalyn C. Maningding, Advisor. St. Clair, Mr. Gaudencio D. Suarez Jr., Advisor.
St. Francis, Mr. Benjamin C. de Guzman, Advisor. St. James, Mrs. Josephine V. Barte, Advisor. St. John, Dr. Christian C. Tulaw, Advisor.
St. Joseph, Mrs. Marjorie B. de Guzman, Advisor. St. Jude, Mrs. Myra S. Valio, Advisor.
St. Lorenzo Ruiz, Mr. Cristoni D. Tinte, Advisor. St. Luke, Mr. Romuel F. Ballesteros, Advisor.
St. Mark, Mr. Dennis P. Bruan, Advisor.
St. Matthew, Mrs. Crescencia S. Bulataw, Advisor.
St. Nicholas, Miss Mia Anessa P. de la Cruz, Advisor. St. Paul, Miss Janine P. Maningding, Advisor. St. Pedro Calungsod, Mrs. Meloden E. Balberan, Advisor. St. Peter, Mr. Mark Glenn Q. Episcope, Advisor.
St. Therese, Mr. Juden T. Capito, Advisor. St. Thomas, Mrs. Carolina C. Valdez, Advisor.
St. Vincent, Miss Julina P. John, Advisor. And now, here are the awardees of academic excellence. Bendicio Ken Emmanuel G. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Bendicio.
Bonifacio Zeus Angelo G. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rolito C. Bonifacio.
Kalimlim Lime S. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Z. Kalimlim.
Calyanta Mark Justin A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Dexter C. Calyanta.
Coronia Francis M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. June Coronia.
De Guzman Thea Margot B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Chodorico C. De Guzman Jr.
De Leon Lijume D. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Leonidas C. De Leon.
De Los Santos Jamila Rees E. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ramil R. De Los Santos.
Estrada Jodrell N. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joey P. Estrada.
Lagat Gian Kim E. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Erwin C. Lagat.
Loresco Ruby May P. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Robert C. Loresco.
Marabe Shikaina P. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Vladimir T. Marabe.
Oviedo Cyril A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Fredes B. Oviedo Jr.
Kitlong Hyacinth Ian G. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Berting F. Kitlong.
Santos Julius Erwin M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy C. Santos.
Tomenis Benloy Derek D. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Benedict S. Tomenis.
Vesperas Stephanie Joy A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jojo B. Vesperas.
Bautista Kyle Shoban G. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo P. Bautista.
Kabuwang Rachel Ann D. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Roderick F. Kabuwang.
Kakapit Krisha Nicole L. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jet Carlo T. Kakapit.
Kapinpin Genuine Alexis P. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Kapinpin.
Cardenas Jasmine and you with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Noel T. Cardenas.
Carion Renz Jaren C. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Pedro A. Carion.
Cruz Lizelle B. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jonard C. Cruz.
Dalope Caifa Grace M. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodelio M. Dalope.
Fernandez Joanna Sofia T. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Merlo D. Fernandez.
Manluktaw Lindsay Raven P. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Loreto D.C. Manluktaw.
Pukis Mika D. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Artemio G. Pukis Jr.
Porlaje Maika Jaya C. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan D. Porlaje.
Kiambao Karil Ann P. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Carlo Angelo V. Kiambao.
Quinto Nian Kerften M. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Mark Nelson D. Quinto.
Surot Rishome M. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Richie M. Surot.
Villanueva Hazel Kate M. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Zarax F. Villanueva.
Abina Dana Alexi G. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Dexter Abina.
Buen Consejo Trixie Lynn M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Benito Buen Consejo Jr.
Bustillo Maribel F. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Marvel Bustillo.
Tumagas Ray Christian C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ryan Dumagas.
Fernandez Jairams B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joey Fernandez.
Ferrer Jaren V. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jason Ferrer.
Galgo Ashley Nicole A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto Galgo.
Garcia Rayo R. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Randy Garcia.
Gray Alexa Nicole B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Frank Nino Gray.
Labrador Jedrick Rayan F. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Alan Labrador.
Loresco Yazalpate S. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Oliver Loresco.
Mandapat Charlene A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Salvador Mandapat Jr.
Mayugba John Bosco P. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Isagani Mayugba.
Mula Jeramil Kurt D.V. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Job Mula.
Officiar National Sophia Q. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Neil Officiar.
Palisok J.J. Kirby S. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jefferson Palisok.
Petines Tanver Ray Q. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Petines.
Ramos Christine S.A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Sonny Ramos.
Ramos Patrick D.B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodante Ramos.
Rodriguez Jessica D. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Juanito Rodriguez Jr.
Ruiz Russell A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Ruiz.
Sante Yuan Harvey D. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Harold Sante.
Sison Riza C. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Sison.
Suarez Justin C. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Suarez.
Taloban Justin Cyril C. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo Taloban.
Tandok David June S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Sabino Tandok.
Villanueva Altea F. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Villanueva.
Abukay John William L. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joy Abukay.
Ballesteros Jater Harry F. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodrigo Ballesteros.
Balolong Kimberly T. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Balolong.
Bruan Maria Andrea P. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Andres Bruan.
Karcha Kyla C. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Noel Karcha.
Castro Jasme Z. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. James Castro.
Kayabyab Brenna Faith H. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Freddy Kayabyab.
Ito Aki V. With high honors, Mr. Kiyoshi Ito and Mrs. Maria Teresa de Vera.
Marzan JCT. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Arnel Marzan.
Perez Jeff Zach V. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jeffrey Perez.
Purissima Melanie May O. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Melchor Purissima.
Tulao Maria Luisa S. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Tulao.
Puntalan Sofia Micaela P. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert Puntalan.
Vicente Jillian U. With high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Mark Anthony Vicente. Abulencia Keith Brandon B. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Angel S. Abulencia Jr.
Alacar Edna May S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Eddie F. Alacar.
Ballesteros Benz Cristel G. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Benji A. Ballesteros.
Benito Jillian A. With honors, Mrs. Jennifer Andrada.
Bongar John Humphrey C. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Bongar.
Chris Angela Faith S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Nelson T. Breeze.
Breeze Josephine S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Nelson T. Breeze.
Cabanya Eliza May M. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodel M. Cabanya.
Cabanas Marshall Kent A. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Maximo N. Cabanas Jr.
Kapitan Erica Sheika Ibeth C. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Roderick Kapitan.
Karcha Russell Miles D. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo Karcha Jr.
Carrion John Lee F. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Beverly Carrion.
Chen Ivan Miguel F. With honors, Mrs. Vivian F. Chen.
Dagang Von Anselmo F. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rovi Jean F. Dagang.
Dalope Brian Giro C. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Brian T. Dalope.
The twin Carl Michael S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Joseph the Twin.
De La Cruz R.J.R. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ruben P. De La Cruz.
Deline Bryant Dave Marque G. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Mark Anthony Deline.
Ferrer Shira Kyle O. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph C. Ferrer.
Flores Jayalyn C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Amormio Flores.
Gavina Vince Roddick C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodelio Gavina.
Idos Aldred Jaimel A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Alvin M. Idos.
Makaalay Sam Melvin F. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Norberto Makaalay.
Makaraeg Jeline N. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Juan D. Makaraeg Jr.
Manabat Jude D. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. John L. Manabat Jr.
Mendoza Cyrone E. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Roland Mendoza.
Mercado Crislene G. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Crisanto D. Mercado.
Paraan Roseline Miles P. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rico Paraan.
Pasokin Raven D. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Renato Pasukin.
Quebrantos Jessame C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Dominador Quebrantos.
Ramas Diana Rose B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rusty Q. Ramos.
Romero Sam Andre V. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Bernardo S. Romero.
Rosario Jasmine Joy L. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Pepito P. Rosario.
Salindayaw Karil Joy P. with honors, Mrs. Myla Salindayaw.
Salindayaw Rian Denise P. with honors, Mrs. Myla Salindayaw.
Shibata Hideo U. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Gemma Untalan.
Suratos Ace B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ropito Divi Suratos.
Villanueva Erwin L. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Villanueva.
Villanueva John Peter A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Peter Villanueva.
Villegas Jonaline O. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Freddy S. Villegas.
Mejia Alia May F. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Arnel D. Mejia. Abalos Jewel Rhea B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jovito D. Abalos.
Alano Mary Jane B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joaquin Alano.
Basco John Ray S. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Josemarie S. Basco.
Biagtan Rebecca Q. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Renato Biagtan.
Kabading Cyrene Jane E. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Geraldine M. Kabading.
Kalikdan MJ Trixie P. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Marconi Kalikdan.
Kawile Mark Caven D. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Crisanto S. Kawile.
Carilla Jaron Edric O. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Domingo Carilla.
Caspillian Faith M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Giovanni B. Caspillian.
Katubig Christian Dave B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Randy Katubig.
Corla Princess Rizal P. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo G. Corla.
De Guzman Crizel Day C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Crisanto de Guzman Sr.
De Leon Kurt Justin S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan B. De Leon.
Desena Allen Cyril F. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Steve B. Desena.
Discipulo Arian Krishna S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Erickson G. Discipulo.
Elenzano Selena Raylene G. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Elenzano.
Falarcuna Ian M. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rex M. Falarcuna.
Ferrer Blessing May T. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Norman G. Ferrer.
Flores Jasmine Miles C. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Marlon F. Flores.
Hunatas Ayala Cyrene E. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Roger U. Hunatas.
Lumibaw Pauline Nicole A. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Mark Anthony M. Lumibaw.
Manzon IZR. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Manuel Manzano Jr.
Maybalo Prince Bullet A. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph A. Maybalo.
Orayensa Cel John G. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Arturo A. Orayensa Jr.
Pampilon Allen Vincent Z. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Alexander E. Pampilon.
Paramio Hazel Ann S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Armando G. Paramio.
Peralta Monica C. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Francisco B. Peralta.
Perez Avril Ray Jane S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Raynor Perez.
Reyes Angelica May G. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Nomer P. Reyes.
Sanggalang Mark Vincent C. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ramon Sanggalang.
Santos Carl Denver A. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Dennis S. Santos.
Segundo Angel S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. John John H. Segundo.
Tenorio Mark Aaron B. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rolando D. Tenorio.
Tulagan Angelica G. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Tulagan.
Abarcar Heda Angeli P. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Hill C. Abarcar.
Aguilar Riza Joy S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ellie Aguilar.
Ahedo Clem Michael D. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Arnel Ahedo.
Alano Brian Errol Paul C. With honors, Mr. Apollo Samson and Miss Teresita Alano.
Alicia's Precious Leia M. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Frank B. Alicias.
Almoite Precious Angela Marie M. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Almoite. Aquino Giancarlo D. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ramil Aquino.
Benitez Gian Denver M. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jerry M. Benitez.
Kalimkim Joshua Philip D.S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Noel Kalimkim.
Kalimkim Radeline R. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodilio Z. Kalimkim. Cervantes Carlos C. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jose G. Cervantes.
Servas Liana D. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Carlitos Servas.
Dalope Carlos Jr. O. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Carlos Dalope Sr.
De Los Santos Aliana M. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Alan De Los Santos.
El Sisura Jeziel May I. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jundi L. Sisura.
Evaristo Johnson Lloyd M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Gerson Evaristo.
Fabito K. N. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Arturo F. Fabito.
Garcia Jude Ray C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Christopher Garcia.
Gida Juliana M. with honors, Mrs. Gwynelyn Marie Gida.
La Figuera Trixie May M. with honors, Mrs. Rowena M. La Figuera.
Meneses Prince Saji E. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Meneses.
Morante Aljan B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Morante.
Opiano Elijah May Cyril A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jumir D.S. Opiano.
Paeste Carlos Miguel R. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Noel Paeste.
Paraino Kizayume H. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald T. Paraino.
Pascua Reina Isabel P. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Noli Pascua.
Santos Shamil B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Reggie T. Santos.
Sendayan Eliza Jean C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Aristeo Sendayan.
Solar Liza May C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo V. Solar.
Suarez Jovela D.N. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Suarez.
Valio Regeline R. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Geraldine R. Valio.
Vesperas Meryl Jasmine G. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. David Vesperas.
Yabut John Louis S. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ramil Yabut.
Manavin Sara Michelle N. with high honors, Mr. and Mrs. Moises Manavin.
Arceo Denise Rose G. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Edison G. Arceo Jr.
Kaigas Adriana Kyle B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Tony Kaigas.
Canoy Rayome C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodel I. Canoy.
Capua Angelica O. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. William Capua.
Cardenas Calimar S. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Marshall F. Cardenas.
Castillo Stephanie U. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Virgilio Castillo Jr.
Garcia Monique Joy M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ramon A. Garcia.
Jega Michael N. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Leominador Vega.
Gonzales Linnea May Q. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Cliff P. Gonzales.
Makatlang Arlene Joy G. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Arnolfo Dulot.
Machas Sharome M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Michael J. D. Matias.
Morante Leyares C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rick Morante.
Pidlawan Jemima C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo Pidlawan.
Reyes Anita Micah C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Marlon Reyes Sr.
Velasco Crishofe P. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Walter Velasco.
Villafania Kale Gian O. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Eric Villafania.
Acurin Ayesa D. with honors, Miss Cristina Dalida.
Ancheta Richmond Jake A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Ancheta.
Arcelo Joshua Matthew R. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Romel Arcelo.
Arganoza Sandara May B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Salvador Arganoza.
Batalya Leia B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Andy Batalya.
Yala Denver J. A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Peter Biala.
Cervantes Ira Joyce T. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Antonio Cervantes.
De la Cruz Cyril S. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Sonny De La Cruz.
De la Cruz Tricia May A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Michael De La Cruz.
Fabia Sheila May D. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Fabia.
Flores Angelica Joy B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jomer Flores.
Gabrielio Gabriel Jr. B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Gabriel Gabrielio Sr.
Garcia Ryan R. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Randy Garcia.
Mandapat Justin P. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Gary Mandapat.
Maramba Kenji with honors, Mrs. Maria Cristina Segundo.
Pagaduan Precious Highwich M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Pagaduan.
Paraan Althea Criziel A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Paraan Jr.
Pinlac Shane D. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Neil Pinlac.
Cuarteros Winilyn B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Erwin Cuarteros.
Quinto Mariel May G. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Mel Quinto.
Ramolete Hanmei T. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Freddy Ramolete.
Salvador Samantha P. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Salvador.
Solis Lebron Lawrence L. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Federico Solis.
Tulaw Darlene Glo N. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rami Tulaw.
Versailles Brian N. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ramon Versailles.
Villafania Jemart M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Villafania.
Alacar John Paulo C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Arsenio Alacar.
Ballesteros Armia S. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Armando Ballesteros.
Balolong Joanna May I. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Marlon Balolong.
Bautista Micaela S. with honors, Mrs. Ami Bautista.
Cabanlong Madeline D. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Marlon Cabanlong.
Cabrera Jaira S. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joel Cabrera.
Kalimkim Riza Joyce S. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ramon Kalimkim.
Kapwa Keith Ivan C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Alvin Kapwa.
De Vera Rodalia P. with honors, Mrs. Gina De Vera.
De Los Santos Jocelyn M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph De Los Santos.
Espiritu Roxanne Brian C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rohel Espiritu.
Fabito Jade Mariel M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Marvin Fabito.
Hunatas Jessica Eve P. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ildefonso Hunatas.
Monteverde Villa Pauline S. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Monteverde.
Montoya Justin Clark DG with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jeffrey Montoya.
Nerezon Jenny L. with honors, Mrs. Virginia Rivera.
Nicolas Gian Gwinnett U. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jimmy Nicolas.
Paraan Franz Gian M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Francis Paraan.
Pascual Angel May M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodrigo Pascual.
Ramos Vanessa May B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Ramos.
Reyes Rainiel A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Elizabeth Reyes.
Rolosta Erica V. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jeremias Rolosta.
Soriano Zoilin Rosbea T. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie Soriano.
Tuason Sofia Nicole A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Noel Tuason.
Ventura Stephanie K. T. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Noelito Ventura. Aquino Karine Ann M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand A. Aquino.
Berot Julia May M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Berot.
Cuerdo Jasmine V. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jessie P. Cuerdo.
Rivera Christian F. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Hilario C. De Vera.
De Vera Jemima Kesha C. with honors, Mrs. Evelyn Lourdes Agustin.
Fernandez Alexandria C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Alex Q. Fernandez.
Francisco Dayome A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Gary D. Francisco.
Covero Angel Nicole D. with honors, Mrs. Verna Ann Covero.
La Forteza Evan Grace F. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo A. La Forteza.
Lucena Jomari A. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Marivic Lucena.
Macalanda K.O. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Norman Macalanda.
Marina Maria Angelica Q. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Geoffrey Marina.
Montemayor Princess Andrea M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Marvin C. Montemayor.
Non Roldan John Jr. C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Roldan John B. Non Sr.
Soblechero Jopay E. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Manuel M. Soblechero Jr. Arenas Akira with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Amparo D. Arenas.
Arenas Risha May C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rafael Arenas.
Baroka Jasmine C. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ruben K. Baroka.
Bernardo Iris R.V. B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodrigo L. Bernardo.
Cacho Micaela Jane D. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Mar E. Cacho.
De Guzman Mary Maisha G. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Georgie De Guzman.
De Leon Princess Kyla L. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Nelson R. De Leon.
Juquino Hena S. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Henry Juquino.
Conrado Enrique III G. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Enrique C. Honrado Jr.
Laida Ronaldine D. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ramon Laida.
Santos Rehena M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Richard T. Santos.
Velasco Maria Eliza L. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Antonio Velasco.
Ija Trisha Angela B. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Marshall F. Idia. Kapinpin Rin Aldrich Q. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo D. Kapinpin.
Cardenas Kristen Jade M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Christopher Cardenas.
Dagara Gwendolyn V. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Dagarat.
Juvenal Princess Bea M. with honors, Mr. and Mrs. Dennis Juvenal.
Soriano Brando Lee S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Almer Q. Soriano.
Suarez Marjorie R. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Jessie S. Suarez.
Taluban Ashby S. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Norberto C. Taluban Jr.
Tranquilino Babylin M. With honors, Mrs. Vivian Tranquilino.
Villanueva Luisa May P. With honors, Mrs. Marilu P. Villanueva. Camacho Julian Zyril S. With honors, Mrs. Lovelea S. Camacho.
Purpose Laika V. With honors, Mrs. Girly Luwayon.
Getulio Fev Isel G. With honors, Mrs. Jennifer G. Getulio.
Lalamora Dean Mark B. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Janato R. Lalamoro.
Lamsen Ferena Ann D. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Felipe A. Lamsen.
Marilia Judith Natalie A. With honors, Mrs. Bernadette A. Marilia.
Ugay Kayana M. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rafael V. Ugay.
Vargas Riza F. With honors, Mrs. Virginia Flores.
Dalope Kisha D. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Wilfredo Fernandez.
Landinin Divina Grace G. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Renato M. Landinin.
Gonzalez Jesame U. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand G. Gonzalez.
Laida Joan D. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Placido N. Laida.
Reyes Christine Nicole B. With honors, Mrs. Cristina B. Reyes. De la Cruz Micaela Rain P. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rodelio de la Cruz.
De la Cruz Rolando Jr. M. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rolando de la Cruz Sr.
Torvelia Reynaline R. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Renante Torvelia.
Ballesteros Nicole L. With honors, Mrs. Rosalie L. Ballesteros.
Kachin Marjorie B. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Gary C. Kachin. Mercado Winmay M. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Winford Mercado.
Santos Christine Joy C. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Freddy Santos.
Dalope Mark Angelo V. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Rolando Dalope.
Santos Rose Ann L. With honors, Mr. and Mrs. Roger Santos.
Words of Gratitude by Joanna Sofia T. Fernandez, Grade 10 Newton.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, let us all be grateful to our God for keeping us safe, protected, and healthy. He is the reason why we are all here and able to attend the ceremony of the new chapter in our lives. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our parents, relatives, teachers, classmates, and friends for their support, especially throughout our situation during this pandemic. The last 2 years of our junior high are really tough, not just for the learners like us, but also for our teachers. It's really hard to cope with learning, especially when we don't have someone to talk to face-to-face to gain some new ideas or get curious about something. Even slow internet, gadgets, and printers Just to name the few of the problems we encountered, we all survived. I know we suffered financially, physically, emotionally, socially, and most importantly, mentally. I hope everyone to have a peace of mind this time. Cheers to everyone. Please give yourselves a round of applause for surviving the hardship we encountered during the whole journey of our junior high. What we have experienced, let us don't forget that we have the ability to adapt to whatever situation we are in. Let us always remember that we have a God who gives us comfort if we are exhausted, guides us if ever we are lost, and protects us if ever we are in danger. Let's all stay stronger to face the future. Thank you and congratulations to all.
More words of gratitude will now be given by John William L. Abukay, Grade 10 St. Andrew.
To our Schools Division Superintendent, Dr. Eli Esobaldo. To our Public Schools District Supervisor, Dr. Diana C. Baguio. Our beloved Principal, Dr. Olivia P. Terado. To my fellow completers, schoolmates, parents, and friends, a pleasant day to all of you. The three great factors in the success of every student are dedication, hard work, and determination. I could never be where I am today if I failed to adhere to these good traits. I have gone through lots of challenges, which made me a better and stronger person. I saw failures and successes, but I am proud I made my way up. Now I stand before you, filled with happiness and gratitude. Thank you, God, for your love and guidance. Thank you to my family, who are always there to support me, most especially my Mama Lola, who is my greatest motivator. To my mommy and daddy, I will always remember your words. You don't need to be the best, but always do your best. To my aunts and uncles who are always there to support me and my siblings, I cannot thank you enough. You are my inspiration. To the teachers since I started schooling, words are not enough to thank you all for sharing your knowledge and molding me into what I am today. Indeed, I believe teaching is the most noble profession. To my fellow completers, let us remember that being successful and happy is a choice. The things or the achievements we have right now are not yet the greatest in our lives. The decisions we make today affect our lives tomorrow. Keep aiming high. To the entire teaching staff of Daniel Maramba National High School, may you continue to uphold the values of a good educator, wisdom, and integrity. Thank you very much, and a pleasant day to all of us.
The closing remarks of our Grade 10 Class Coordinator, Dr. Princess Christine N. Cabansag.
To our Indefatigable Public Schools District Supervisor, Dr. Diana C. Baguio, our motherly and dynamic school principal, Dr. Olivia P. Terado, the very able heads of the different departments, our ever-loving parents and stakeholders, my fellow hard-working Grade 10 advisors, the industrious teachers of Daniel Maramba National High School, dearest Grade 10 completers, friends, ladies and gentlemen, a blessed, blissful, and wonderful day to one and all. It is indeed an honor for me to give a message of thanks and appreciation for what had happened, what had transpired in this academic year of 2021-2022. I know that our journey in learning and teaching in this so-called new normal, brought by the health crisis faced around the globe, has never been easy. We've been doubtful of things, thinking whether it is possible or not, even to ourselves, if we could make it, if we could survive it, and if we could reach the glorious end. this Moving Up ceremony. With all the apprehensions we felt because of these trying times, the challenges and struggles of answering your modules, your need and clamor of the face-to-face instructions, look where you are positioned now, my dear learners. You really did survive. Your effort, courage, and perseverance brought you this far. Yes, you just made it. You are now confirmed completers, ready to move forward for the senior high school. Congratulations to all of you. Congratulations to your parents. At this juncture, I give my gratitude to Dr. Olivia P. Terrado, our school principal, for trusting me with this job. To Dr. Judith M. Camacho and Mr. Mark Ian R. Tamayo for the guidance and support as our curriculum heads. To my department head, Mr. Jovito Q. Idos, for being a great mentor. To all grade 10 advisors and subject teachers for their commitment and dedication to work. To our parents for hanging in there, doing their jobs as learning facilitators at home. To the different committees of this virtual ceremony, making this program possible. My heart is so full. Thank you to everyone. God bless you all and mabuhay.
According to Tom Hanks, the future is always uncertain. But we who celebrate what you have done,
who celebrates all of your achievements, we are certain of one thing on this day.
you will not let us down. This has been your Masters of Ceremony. I am Jan Patrick C. Manangan.
And I am Janine P. Maningding.
Congratulations, completers!